All right. Well, we are live. Thank you for joining me, folks. We are here for the Zero Hedge debate that is going to focus on the latest appointments by President-elect Trump to his cabinet. I am joined by Darren Beattie and Max Blumenthal, who I'll just join in just a second. You might be surprised seeing me, folks. I'm Adam Taggart. You may know me as the host of Thoughtful Money. Your host for tonight was supposed to be Judge Napolitano. At the very last moment, he was unable to attend. So the folks from Zero Hedge gave me the call, asked if I could parachute in. That's why you get me as your host for the next hour or so as we have this debate. As I said, the resolution on the docket tonight is Trump's second term and the folks that he is appointing to help him run it. Is this going to be an America First agenda? And if so, what is that likely going to look like? I am joined, as I said, by Darren Beattie, who's a former speechwriter for President-elect Trump. He's founder of Revolver News. He's best known for his reporting on the January 6 riots. He's also a former visiting professor at Duke University. Joining him will be Max Blumenthal, a veteran foreign policy journalist and editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone. He's also author of the book Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
All right, now, gentlemen, I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be a rip-roaring debate, as it is maybe more like a comparison of notes from very informed minds who know the inner situation there in the White House, specifically a Trump White House, and know a lot of the personalities involved. But let's very quickly, let's start dialing through his appointees. Before we do that, though, I've got a general question for you. And before I do that, I want to do two quick things. One is to thank the sponsor for tonight's debate. That is JM Bullion. They're, I think, the main sponsor of these Zero Hedge debates. So if you like them, you've got JM Bullion to thank. Also, to let you know, we will do our best to include some interactivity here with you, the audience, tonight. I will dial through these main questions that I have prepared for today's experts. And then once we get through them all, we'll do our best to start fielding as many questions from the Zero Hedge audience as we can. Darren and Max, if I can kick this off, and maybe Darren, we will start with you, and then we'll move on to you, Max. Do you think Trump's administration will indeed be, quote, America First? What does that look like to you, if indeed the answer is yes? Why or why not?
Starting
so Darren,
with
if we
me?
can kick off with you, yeah.
Yes, I think it will be America First. I mean, obviously, I don't want to be the philosopher here, although I've been one in the past. We have to kind of define what America First means. And I've stated in previous public remarks that the very notion of America First, it can be very simple, but it can also be quite complicated. Just an example that I gave. One sort of thing that people associate with America First is putting American companies first. What does that mean in the context of, in the past years when American companies would, for instance, pay deference to the BLM movement? Is it America First to support a corporation that happens to be American, but supports the BLM movement, as opposed to some foreign corporation that is politically neutral in that respect? And so I think you can generalize that question to say that if the institutions of America are actuated against and hostile toward the best interests and the flourishing of the American citizenry, then what does it mean to say America First? It's not just supporting the interests of some of the key stakeholders in the American economy and so forth. And so with that sort of complication set aside, I'd say, in the sense in which I think most people intuitively understand it, yes, I fully suspect the second term will be America First, and certainly far more America First than any previous presidency, far more America First than the people he's run against and defeated.
Great. Max, we'll come to you in one quick second. I know I'm going to have a lot of clarifying questions for all of you. Darren, I'm just going to ask you a quick one. Would you say then that this is going to be sort of rolling the clock back on globalization, at least as far as America has participated in it?
Well, it depends what you mean by globalization there. I mean, I hate to sort of complicate those issues. You know, he's not an isolationist. He's not, in economics, you have to, really say what you mean by globalization. I think that in the domains of economics, domain of foreign policy, and the domain of sort of domestic policy, all of the things that he's going to do will transform America for the better relative to other administrations and relative to people's expectations, the critics' expectations.
Okay, great. And I'll give you lots of opportunities to give examples of that later on,
Mhm.
should you like to. All right. Well, Max, let's hear your sort of opening comments here on the main theme here. Do you too expect it to be America first? And if so, what does that mean to you?
Well, let me first just kind of stake out my own position. Darren and I have very different worldviews, political philosophies, but there are also points of agreement, which is why maybe this won't be a massive Tyson Paul fight. Uh, Actually, we'll deliver better than that anyway. But
I was going to say the bar on that one wasn't super high. So yeah, hopefully we can step above.
yeah, and I'm not even in my 50s yet. But I know I like a lot of the work Darren's done at Revolver. The January 6th investigation was really informative and eye-opening. We both went after Nina Jankowicz because she was going after us. We both hate the censorship industrial complex, but the gray zone and myself were generally associated with the left, the anti-war left. And I think there are points of agreement in places where we can work together on stopping what Donald Trump Jr. called the neoconservative military industrial complex that wants to take us to World War III. And in some ways, we already are in World War III. So when I approach a Republican administration, I typically expect an administration like George W. Bush's, which is completely pro industry, wants to deregulate everything, get rid of all as many worker protections as possible, allow massive monopolies to form, is owned by Wall Street in in some ways as much as and more than the Democrats are. And here you have a Republican administration that represents a movement called America First, which I'm not a part of, but which diverges from traditional Republican administrations in some ways, which I find refreshing. You can see that reflected in Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, what do we expect from Director of National Intelligence? We expect Jim Clapper. So
Mhm.
it could be refreshing change. Uh, there are a few other picks that I think offer some possibility for reforming some awful institutions. Brendan Carr at the FCC taking on the censorship industrial complex, which we've taken on at the Gray Zone. But there's this common thread between all these picks, which contradicts what I think the original spirit of America First is. And it's the Israel First agenda, which has been imposed by the mafia donna, Zionist mafia donna, Miriam Adelson, who has promised Donald Trump $100 million through a super PAC to help fund his ground game. Donald Trump went and kissed the ring of Miriam Adelson. So too did Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who I think could bring a lot of important reform to HHS. Tulsi Gabbard did the same thing. Pretty much all of them have had to bow down to the most extreme factions of Israeli politics. And so we have to ask why that is and what kind of implications that will have for an America First foreign policy that brands itself as America First, but which could wind up being as empty a brand as BLM is now by the end.
All right. Well, look, I've got a list of the appointees that I know the Zero Hedge guys want us to walk through and get your both of your feedback on. Before I do that, though, if you guys don't mind, I'd like to ask a couple of clarifying questions here in reaction to what you both said, just so folks understand your positions a little bit better. So, Darren, I want to come back to you for a second. So it sounds like Max feels like America First will be great for U.S. corporations. Donald Trump's all about economic growth, right? And so, Max, if I heard you correctly, you think it's going to be just showing even more love to the U.S. corporate sector. I think you said allowing even monopolies to thrive.
Well, let me clarify there. I
Yeah.
say traditional Republican administrations since Reagan have allowed that to take place, but a Matt Gaetz DOJ may actually take on some of the monopolies as he did in Congress. So I'm saying there are some divergences here.
Okay, so sorry, I missed that. I didn't realize that was one of your areas for hope. Okay, so then maybe you two aren't as far apart as I might have thought. But here's my question for both of you, and Darren, I'll let you ask first. It's funny. I agree with Max that I think has characterized many previous Republican administrations. Honestly, I think people would think it characterizes recent Democratic administrations. Corporate America has done very well, even just the past 4 years. Whereas the citizenry, I think, has really felt increasingly left behind. I think it's been a big part of the populist support behind Trump here. So when we hear America First, at least as Trump says it, and judging from his appointments, do you have hope that he's trying to swing the balance of power or the balance of fairness a little bit more towards the citizen again, away from the corporates, or is this going to be business as usual?
Well, I certainly think he's going to sway the balance of power toward the people. The people delivered an historic mandate for Trump. In the first time around, you had Trump running and winning against the coordinated hostility and opposition of every single powerful institution in the world, effectively. And he won by virtue of having support of the people. That was a narrow win. And you see something similar in this regard. I mean, if you look at the kind of iconic and very memorable speeches that he's delivered, it's all been about, okay, this time, we're restoring power to the people. I don't, however, subscribe to a kind of, I approach things very non-ideologically, as I think that Trump does, in the following sense, is that I don't think just because something is good for a certain corporate sector, that means necessarily it's bad for the people.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I happen to think that, I think a lot of the climate change stuff is just kind of a scam for another set of special interests. And I don't think it's opposed to the interest of the American people to, for instance, have, more fracking, and that could be consistent with a pathway toward energy independence. I think a lot of the regulations that have been in place have constrained the creativity and productivity of the talented people in the country. And so, again, I think a lot of these things we might have to drill down to a more granular level to see where the opposition really lies. Because yes, there's crony capitalism. Yes, there is, big tech that was responsible for a lot of horrible things, including censorship. Now the term big tech is even more complicated, with Elon's entering into the political arena and so forth. And so I think instead of resting on sort of a paradigm of whatever is in the interest of any major corporation is bad and necessarily like ipso facto opposed to the people's interests, and the people, we might say, like the interests of a broad and robust and flourishing middle class, that's not necessarily the case. I certainly don't think that's the case. And so I think for a kind of more productive conversation in that regard, we'd have to be a little bit more specific about what corporations, what the conflict is and what the issue is. Because I certainly think that Trump is pro-corporate America, but I think in a way that's far more consistent with the interests of the people in the middle class, as opposed to any other elected president, any other person who's even been nominated to run as president. Which brings another issue that I think should kind of condition this discussion. It's not a debate, just discussion. It should condition the discussion, which is that we should grade things on the curve of reality. Okay. And so I think the fair benchmark should be people who in the past have been president, the recent past have been president, or, to be more, liberal about it, people in the past who have at least have secured a nomination for the presidency. Because I don't want to simply, be presumptive about, what Max thinks, but a lot of the criticisms I see are criticisms that are simply not taking that realistic benchmark into account and are thinking like, we're, already graded on the curve of reality, having Tulsi Gabbard as the head intelligence official, having RFK head of, Health Human Services. Speaking of corporate interests, look at what's happening to the pharma stocks. Having Matt Gaetz as head of the Department of Justice already, I think, is pretty unbelievably good, with reality as a benchmark. So I just wanted to say that as well.
Okay, I'm interested to dig more into kind of reality as the lever here, and where you see examples of reality sort of trumping everything else. But if I heard your answer right, I think you answered my question, which is for sure Trump will be pro business, but it looks like he's going to be pro business to the extent that it is pro citizen, and that's going to be his guiding light here. All right, let me take a pause. Max, your thoughts on this?
I'm not sure what the question is. Maybe you
want so the question was, historically previous administrations have been very pro-business, again, even as I said earlier, even the Democratic ones, right? And the change that Trump is promising is in many ways predicated on bringing America to even greater economic heights. But the tenor of this seems like it could be different in the sense that, given the popular support that elected him, it's not just going to be all about corporate America. This time it's going to be about corporate America, but the primacy, the prime priority is going to be what's good for the average U.S. citizen. And I think that's what I heard Darren say. Curious if you think that and trust Trump to deliver that.
I mean, I'll make a couple or 2 or 3 points on that. I mean, first, my idea of the epitome of evil in an American administration is the George W. Bush administration, which represents the liberal international order imposed at the barrel of a gun, neoconservatism, plus just a corporate free-for-all across the US, setting total deregulation, setting the stage for the financial crash that actually helped bring Donald Trump to power after Obama continued the Wall Street program of bailouts and letting the banksters off the hook.
Administration's policy towards Wall Street.
So I am judging things against the current reality and looking at a Republican administration where there's some areas for possible change and reform is refreshing. So I'm not, going to approach this as a leftist utopian. I mean, this is what we've got. But America First is it's supposed to have principles and it needs to be critiqued. And Lindsey Graham is a neoconservative, the standard bearer of neoconservatism in Congress today since John McCain died, who claims the mantle of America First and has advanced it after he negotiated with Donald Trump to release some $75 billion in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, including paying the salaries of Ukrainian state employees and pensioners, which seems to go against the spirit of America First. Donald Trump played a role in that negotiation, along with Mike Johnson, who was just hanging out with the cool kids of America First at Madison Square Garden. So what's going on? What America First will show up, and will it benefit Americans if sanctions are maintained on so many oil producing countries, because the US is not energy independent now, whether we like it or not? The sanctions that were imposed on Russia, as Joe Biden said, to make Russia's ruble into rubble, have boomeranged. I mean, they've wrecked large sectors of the European economy, but they also hurt the American economy and contributed to inflation and high gas prices, higher food prices. And the sanctions on Venezuela, which is our neighbor, not only produced a migration crisis, which the America First is supposed to be about, but also increased oil prices. I mean, they were taking the oil straight to Texas to refine it and forced the US to start importing oil from Russia after they also sanctioned Iran. And now you have all of these figures who have kissed the ring of Netanyahu and Miriam Adelson coming into key foreign policy positions. Marco Rubio, I don't know if Pete Hegseth will make it. Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon, who seem inclined to take the U.S. to war with Iran. And that's an issue that I think could completely shatter the whole brand of America First. And I know it's not what most Americans want.
Okay, Darren, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that. Obviously, Max has got some very strong concerns about foreign policy.
Right.
Sounds like Israel's high on the list, but he mentioned our attitudes towards a number of the other countries there, number of which Trump played a hand in either recently or in his first administration. So let me let you respond to that, and then we'll start actually just going through the cabinet appointees one by one.
Sure. Asking about what specifically, or maybe I should just go freestyle in response?
Go freestyle, but I think I hear Max saying is look, yeah, there's lots of examples that give him pause that America First is really going to be good for Americans regarding our foreign policy, because there seems to be a lot of preferential treatment we're giving a lot of big players on the world stage that he feels very uncomfortable with.
Sure. I think it's more helpful in these things to look at the bigger picture of what's the agenda on the big picture level that Trump seems to be genuinely committed to. I think with respect to the Ukraine conflict, Trump is very clear that he's interested in ending it, and ending it as soon as possible. In fact, I think one of the more memorable answers from the presidential debate with Trump, and I believe, it was the presidential debate, when they were asked, so who do you want to win the war? And his answer was, or do you want Ukraine to win the war? And his answer was, I just want it to end. That's what winning means, is setting the conditions for the conclusion of this conflict that's really not in the best interests of really anybody involved. And he staked that claim. I think that his actions will be consistent with that objective. As for Iran, another thing that I'm hearing from Max here is, I think perhaps an inordinate concern with Israel as such. Again, just kind of like my approach to the corporations issue. I don't buy into a paradigm that simply because there's a corporation, that means ipso facto it's opposed to the interests of the American people. Some corporations are good, some bad. Some policies that benefit corporations are good for America more generally, and some aren't. Similarly, I don't view things such that, Israel is this, proxy for war as such. That a pro-Israel administration is necessarily a pro-war administration. I don't think that's the case. I think that the Trump approach will be one that will not accept Iran obtaining a nuclear bomb, but is one that will take as an extremely high priority not setting the conditions for a World War III situation in Iran or anywhere else. I think those two objectives are mutually consistent. And just again, kind of in the grading on the curve question, let's look back, even if maybe some of the appointments are not perfect from the standpoint of somebody who's solely focused on foreign policy, although I think we should give these people a benefit of the doubt, at least initially. In the first administration, you had John Mattis at defense. John Mattis was not a good guy. He is very pro-war, in addition to just being incompetent in many other ways. John Mattis at defense. You had Bolton as a national security advisor, who has been publicly repudiated, and Pompeo at the State Department. And so if Trump can manage with that I know. I don't know if I want to appropriate the term from another presidential speechwriter, axis of evil, but certainly a terrible triumvirate, whatever you want to call it. Even with these individuals, nefarious individuals, if Trump can go for an entire term without starting any new wars, if Trump can do that with those three, then Trump can certainly do that with the appointees that we see coming into this new administration. And so I think it's all about that kind of big picture approach. With respect to Ukraine and Russia, the interest is ending this conflict as soon as possible. And with respect to Iran, the interest in we cannot allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, but also we are not interested in setting the conditions for a major global conflict with Iran in the Middle East. I think those things are mutually consistent.
Thank you for that. I'm going to start asking your opinions of the appointees here. Very quickly, though, Darren, I do want to ask you one question because you were inside the previous Trump administration as a scriptwriter or screenwriter, correct? Okay.
Speechwriter and policy aide, yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned some of the people that were in the previous administration who were, let's say, diplomatically problematic. Now Trump picked them. So what is the difference between that time and this time?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think there are quite a few differences. Again, and I'm kind of going to speak in more general terms, but I think they encompass a lot and can be helpful. The dynamic of 2016, at least the election, as I've described it, was the coordinated hostility and opposition of every single powerful institution in the world. And I don't just say the United States, even the Vatican and global institutions, European institutions, everybody came out against Trump and he won. And so that was actually a remarkable demonstration of, sort of a stress test on the democratic process in the non-cynical usage of that term. I know the term has been raped by the people who've done everything to subvert the democratic process in the United States, people like Nina Yankovic and others. But it was an incredible stress test because you had basically people supporting Trump and every powerful institution on the other side, in effect. But the way that this shaped the dynamic after you win is that, you're kind of, what are you left with? There were some good people. I like to think of myself as one of them, and there are exceptions. But I think a general dynamic was one in which you had people whose heart was in the right place, but may not have had the savvy or the institutional knowledge to navigate the profound opposition that Trump faced from his own bureaucracies. So you had the people whose heart was in the right place, but they would get eaten alive by the bureaucracies. And then you had people who understood these bureaucracies, but who weren't necessarily mission aligned. And that's a very difficult choice. And I think that was a general dynamic. Does that mean that, that the appointments were like the best you could do within, the contours of that dynamic? Probably not. But again, I think the end result is what matters. Bolton is a horrible guy. He sucks. Pompeo sucks. Nikki Haley sucks. But even with all of these people, Trump didn't start any wars. And that, at the end of the day, is what's important. So, so compared to the dynamic that I described now, I think that it's somewhat different. I think that Trump has been, in some key respects, normalized. I think Elon coming in has been very helpful and has caused a kind of preference cascade in some ways that allows people who otherwise would not be publicly supportive and willing to help the agenda come in. I think there have been other developments along those lines. And so I think the intersection of people who are agenda aligned and also capable, that sort of intersection of the Venn diagram is much larger now. And so and also Trump has the benefit of learning from his mistakes. This isn't a foreign policy issue so much, although he's exceptional in foreign policy, very bravely so, Matt Gaetz. But part of the reason that Trump is 100% committed to Matt Gaetz and his confirmation is that he saw what an Achilles heel it can be to have an attorney general who is not courageous and willing to stand up for the agenda. A mistake on the part of an attorney general can lead to problems that compromise the entire agenda writ large, because all of your bandwidth is caught up in this stupid Russia nonsense, for instance. And so I think these appointments alone, in particular Gaetz, but the others as well, indicates that he's learned some very important lessons as, compared to the first time around.
Okay. Okay. Good answer. All right. Well, let's start going through these appointments. I have a list here. I don't think it's in any particular order, but I think we'll hit all the highlights. Max, I'll start with you for your reaction to the appointee. And then once you've spoken your piece, Max, will then go to you, Darren, for any potential additional clarification or any rebuttal. Let's start with Department of Defense head, Pete Hegseth. Max.
Pete Hegseth makes me wonder if Donald Trump is running a DEI program for cretinous white guys who are controlled by Zionist billionaires. I mean, this one is an absolute joke. And while Pete Hegseth will likely be more loyal to the America First agenda than Mike Pompeo was, for example, it's baffling that a figure like this would be picked. I mean, this is someone who said that he suggested this in what apparently paid speech to an extreme pro-Israel, pro-settler group, that he fought not to make peace and prevent new wars from happening in the military, but he fought knowing that his sons, Gunnar, Boone, and Rex, would have to fight a war to defend Israel, and that Israel's interests and the interests of the U.S. are fundamentally intertwined and form the bedrock of Western civilization. Fundamentally intertwined with a country that's been perpetually at war with all its neighbors, that's currently engaged in ethnically cleansing 400,000 people that it's trying to starve out of the northern Gaza Strip so it can take their land. And he wants to be defense secretary. He has, if you Google Pete Hegseth now, it's all about his sexual peccadillos, which is bad, whatever. But, look past that at his defense of Eddie Gallagher, who murdered several civilians, just sniped them for fun, shot little girls for fun in Afghanistan, and advocated for Eddie Gallagher to be freed. I don't know what kind of image he wants to confer on the U.S. military, but it's going to be ugly. And I get why he's there. He wants to go after the woke generals and Milley, who was disloyal to Trump. And, I'm happy to see that because it gums up the works. It's kind of fun to watch. But the real issue isn't whether the military's too gay or whatever, or too DEI. The issue is whether it's going to continue to go to war to defend the strategic depth of a tiny little apartheid state thousands of miles away. And it's a real issue right now. We can't just dismiss it and pretend that Trump won't even possibly authorize a war with Iran, when Pete Hegseth was in Trump's ear as a Fox commentator during the first term, clamoring for war with Iran as Trump took the U.S. to the precipice of war by killing the second most important official in Iran, Major General Qasem Soleimani, completely unprovoked, when Soleimani was on his way to a peace conference to make peace with Saudi Arabia. And Hegseth was in Trump's ear calling for escalation, calling for war. And it was thanks to Tucker Carlson and figures like Kurt Mills that the drive to war was stopped. So you have a dangerous person there who's also obviously dangerously unqualified. And despite his loyalty to Trump, it could lead to some pretty disastrous consequences.
Okay, Darren, coming to you in a second. Just a question for you, Max. Do you have a name off the top of your head that you would like to see for Department of Defense? Someone who you think would be a better candidate who represents more of the values that you'd want to see there?
Well, I mean, it's absurd to ask me because I'm not from the America First movement. I'm just giving my critique. I mean, one of the reasons I'm doing this debate is because people who don't normally agree with me or identify with what we represent at the gray zone are going to listen, and I want to emphasize how that we're walking on a knife's edge right now. The U.S. could possibly be plunged into two direct wars with two very powerful militaries in Russia and Iran. Donald Trump could inherit this war with Russia that Biden is seeking to plunge him in as Biden walks off into the woods in the Amazon jungle cluelessly. But at the same time, the inertia, the pressure for war with Iran is coming from within the forces that helped pay for Donald Trump's campaign. And these are foreign forces. These are not American forces. Miriam Adelson is an Israeli who is connected to the Mossad. Her husband may have been a CIA cutout who helped to destroy Julian Assange, someone Trump once suggested he would free. But, Sheldon Adelson, is her dead husband, said that he regretted fighting for the U.S. military and wished he had fought for Israel instead. He has called for dropping a nuclear weapon on Iran. And if this happens, the global economy will be shattered because Iran will retaliate and attack oil installations across the Persian Gulf, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia. That could easily happen. Iraq could be set on fire. The price of oil will surge, and Trump will be in an enormous bind. So it's up to people who supported Trump on the basis of his pledge to make peace, however sincere it was, to keep the pressure on, to stay in his ear, to keep lobbying him, and don't allow him to go down the route that Miriam Adelson and other billionaires have set for him.
Okay. So coming to you, Darren, clearly it seems, Max, you're not a fan of Hegseth. You think he's more or less bought and paid for by Israel, a war hawk. Seems inconsistent with Trump the peacemaker. What's your rebuttal here? Or reaction?
Well, again, I think that there's an inordinate concern for specifically the Adelsons, Miriam Adelson. I mean, by the own logic of the argument here is that you had all of these people, including Sheldon himself when he was alive, presumably, calling for this one particular policy of nuking Iran or going to war with Iran. And it didn't happen in the first administration. And, to hear the name Miriam Adelson, okay, a lot of people give money. Miriam Adelson, there's the one billionaire that matters most other than Donald Trump is Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is not an interventionist by any means. He's not, a neoconservative or whatever kind of, terms people use to describe this orientation. Not at all. And Elon Musk matters 1,000 times more than Miriam Adelson or any other, person who's donated this time around. And so, again, I would submit that if Trump was able to resist these presumably vociferous calls for war with Iran in the first time around with Mattis, Bolton, Nikki Haley, Pompeo, Adelson, et cetera, he can do it now with Elon Musk and Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, and even with Rubio and Mike Waltz at the NSC. I think the understanding at the high level is we want to bring the Ukraine-Russia conflict to its conclusion. The objective is ending the war. Trump was asked, "Do you want Ukraine to win?" He said, "I want the war to end." Perfect reframing that I think captures his genuine orientation toward things. And similarly with the Middle East, he's reportedly told Bibi to wrap things up. And yes, I think he'll be a very pro-Israel president. I don't think that's a bad thing, but he's not going to be a war with Iran president. So that's sort of how I view those things. As far as Hegseth himself, again, I think if if Trump can resist the entreaties of these other, I think, more forceful personalities in the first administration, Hegseth is not going to be like a decisive force pushing for war in Iran. I do, however, think he genuinely cares about things that are important, maybe not as important as avoiding World War III. I don't think he's going to cause World War III, but cleaning up the craziness within the military. He cared enough about the issue to have me on his show to talk about one individual who was simply crazy and turning the military into a joke. This is controversial territory, but we need to, reevaluate the extent and nature of the service of women in the military. There are other things that he's talked about that I think are important to getting the military on a sound and reasonable footing, as far as being a driving force for some kind of global World War III type conflict. I just don't see that. And again, you can go in these people's histories and see things that might sound outlandish that they're saying about Israel and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think what matters is, what happens. What matters in the first administration, for all the horrendous biography of somebody like John Bolton, there were no wars in the first term. And I think compared to the first term, the voices of reservation in that regard are far more multitudinous and far more powerful than the first time around. And so I think that justifies giving a benefit of the doubt and thinking, okay, there's going to be a very serious effort to avoid having these geopolitical hotspots uh, worsen into a condition that could be something like a global war.
Okay. And, for every one of these, I'm sure we could have an hour-long debate on each appointee. I've got a whole bunch here, so I'm just going to have to dial through. But obviously, if there's a key point the other person made that you feel like you just have to respond to, please just do so unprompted by me. Max, coming back to you, we got Tulsi Gabbard. I'm going to guess you're maybe a little bit more open-minded to Tulsi, certainly than Hegseth.
Yeah, she's an enigmatic figure who is actually gone against the grain of the most malevolent force in the United States, which is really admirable. But at the same time, she's also gone along with the program that appears to have been prescribed to everyone who wants to rise to the top of Trump world. Which, I mean, we can't downplay the influence of Miriam Adelson, who's had previous meetings with Tulsi Gabbard. And when Tulsi Gabbard emerged as someone who is going to be a top Trump surrogate on the campaign trail, she reverted to the foreign policy, the sort of Middle East hawk that she was before she joined the Bernie campaign. But Tulsi Gabbard is someone who has the potential to really reform the intelligence services by investigating abuses, by investigating the intelligence services interference in American politics, which is, I think, something that everyone in Trump's inner circle wants to take on, the weaponization of the intelligence services.
Mm-hmm.
The reason she's hated so much is because she actually has sought peace in places like Syria, and she targeted the real source of the war machine, which was sending over $1 billion in weapons and aid to fanatical jihadist proxies of NATO, which were tearing Syria to shreds. I was at her press conference on Capitol Hill back in 2018 after she came back from her trip, and it shouldn't have been controversial to not send weapons to the allies of al-Qaeda, but only 13 members of Congress went along with her. That's really why she's hated, why Barry Weiss called her the motherlode of bad ideas and an Assad toady. And if you look at the smear piece that just came out at the New York Times about Tulsi Gabbard, everything, what they hate about her is everything that makes her pro-peace and in line with what I think Americans want, which is to turn down the temperature with Russia and stop spreading instability across the Middle East that creates massive migrant outflows. So which Tulsi Gabbard will show up? That's the question that I want to put out there, because right now it's unclear to me.
Okay, got it. And I can't remember if I mentioned that she's been appointed for Director of National Intelligence. I know that's what you spoke to, Max, but just in case I didn't mention earlier, that's what she's being considered for.
And if I could say a few words about that.
I'm handing you the baton, so go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an exceptional choice. Tulsi is extremely wise and knowledgeable when it comes to the abuses within the intelligence community and geopolitics, generally. You know, she knows about the malicious activities of these groups like, you know, the White Helmets and people like Victoria Nuland and all of these scam organizations, whose sole purpose is to dupe the United States into conflicts that it shouldn't be in. She's someone who, going back to Max's point, understands what notoriously came up in one of the leaked WikiLeaks emails with Hillary Clinton, that Al-Qaeda is quote unquote on our side in Syria. She very much understands what that meant. And incidentally, did anyone wonder why was it only when Trump became president that all of a sudden we seemingly quickly, easily, and decisively destroyed ISIS? Does anyone wonder why that was? Like, maybe it was because before that, we were actually supporting ISIS, if not directly, then certainly indirectly. So Tulsi is somebody who understands that as well. And I think the particular role of DNI, which formally sort of sits on top of all of the, I think, 18 intelligence bureaucracies, or maybe they've added more, and is responsible for the intelligence briefing and so forth, is one of the ways that the intelligence community tries to manipulate the president into policies that are not in the interest of America is by manipulating intelligence briefings. And so I think having someone who understands that game, like ultimately responsible there, I think is a tremendous asset, not just to kind of correcting the abuses within intelligence community, but also making sure there's a vetting process such that you don't have these deep state types within the intelligence community manipulating their briefings in a way that's designed to kind of trick us into an escalatory action that's based on a false premise.
Okay, so it sounds very clear like you think Tulsi's an inspired choice here. All right, gentlemen, we'll get to the next name in just a second. We just have a message from our sponsor, so we'll let the Zero Hedge team run that now.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals, they're our standard. Our commitment to customer discretion and privacy with secure and confidential transactions has earned us an unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals, backed by over 375,000 reviews, averaging 4.8 out of 5 stars. Only at JM Bullion. At JM Bullion.
All right, and we're back. Gentlemen, thank you so much. We've just started on the list of appointees, so we got a lot of wood to still chop here. Max, I'll come to you in just a second. Audience, folks watching, if you're enjoying this, please let us know in the comments section below, the good, the bad, what you like, what you'd like to see more of. But very much, we strive to make these things better every time, try to raise the bar every time based upon your feedback. All right, so our next name is Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. Darren, from your previous comments, I think you think that's a pretty good choice too. But Max, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on Mike Waltz?
Well, earlier this month, Mike Waltz called for escalating the Ukraine proxy war and, in his words, taking the handcuffs off of Ukraine, basically supporting what Biden has just done, authorizing ATACMS missile strikes, at least in the Kursk region inside Russia, which now has Russia threatening nuclear retaliation. Mike Waltz, in his bio that was put out by the Trump-Vance Transition Committee, omits his role as an advisor to the father of Liz Cheney, top Kamala surrogate, Dick Cheney. I wonder why they left that out, because Trump justifiably and correctly campaigned against Cheney being an awful and corrupt war criminal tapping into the anger, the still simmering anger of so many Americans about the Iraq War. But here you have someone who was part of the program, someone who is actually endorsed by John Bolton. We saw what John Bolton did to Trump when Trump picked him out of the Fox green room. We saw what H.R. McMaster did to Trump as well. And, with Mike Waltz, it looks like a continuation of the neocon line.
No, I agree that his certain elements of his biography are dubious, to put it mildly, including I think there's also a Rumsfeld association, and so kind of the greatest hits of that George Bush neoconservative era. But at the same time, again, I think given what Trump has achieved, given the mandate he has received, starting from the beginning, I'm willing to give people like this the benefit of the doubt. I have met Waltz a few times. He's a smart guy. He's an impressive guy. And I don't get the sense that there's going to be this driving force to subvert in the way that you would have with a Pompeo or a Nikki Haley or a Bolton. I get the sense that there might be some of these kind of more kind of conventional, because these things, it's not like out of the ordinary, the disposition of wanting to be a little bit more aggressive in Ukraine, more aggressive, in Iran and Russia and so forth. This is sort of par for the course for this kind of specific demographic and element. But I don't get a sense that there's this kind of underlying pathological motivating desire to have that sort of change the direction of the Trump agenda and a sort of the type of personality behind it that could do that. Again, I'd have to just revert back to my other point, which is that if Trump can resist war with Bolton, who, you can criticize Bolton all you want, but he is a force. When he's pushing for something, you feel it. He's effective in certain ways. When you have Bolton, when you have Pompeo, when you have Haley, and you have all this, if Trump can resist the worst angels, so to speak, of the pro-war agenda, I don't think someone like Mike Waltz will be an issue.
Darren, I kind of get the understanding listening to you that you feel like Trump is coming in saying, look.
Also, let me point it out this way, is that given the fact that you had these people like Bolton and Pompeo and Nikki Haley in the first administration and no war, people ask, like, Trump has acknowledged publicly that these people are ridiculous. And I think he's done that largely because they've publicly attacked him and subverted him. But he's also kind of given us a sense of his thinking behind these choices, which is, he's all about this art of the deal and creating leverage and creating perception of things. And I don't think it's altogether crazy. Even what he said was that, look, John Bolton is a nut job, but he was actually pretty helpful just to have this nutcase at my side when I was engaging in negotiation with foreign adversaries, knowing that he would, understanding that the things he's just is somewhat obsessed with war, but
right,
having him there.
Right. I agree to my compromise terms, because otherwise I got to unleash this crazy
Exactly.
guy.
And so he has a demonstrated sense, number one, of being able to resist these people when they call for war, but number two, almost using these nut jobs to a kind of strategic advantage. And so I think that also needs to be taken into account. I'm not suggesting Mike Waltz is anything like that, but I think there is perhaps, given what Trump's statements have been, is like, maybe having someone who's been more hawkish toward Russia in that position can help negotiation terms for whatever the ultimate resolution is to the Ukraine conflict, which Trump has publicly stipulated as the priority there. And um, so I think that also needs to at least be taken into account, is that just because you have someone there, it doesn't simply mean I endorse their positions on these matters, is that having someone there with these positions can be useful in ways that maybe people don't always think about.
And that's what I was going to ask, because I kind of get the impression listening to you that you feel like Trump is saying, look, I'm assembling a team of disruptors to come in and do a lot of disruption, but I also need some insiders that have got some of the old guard DNA to help me navigate and also get the other old guard on the program. And
Sure.
so is that accurate? And if so, do you think Waltz is maybe one of those guys?
Yeah, I don't know about old guard, but he's not, I mean, he's not a Tulsi Gabbard for sure, and that's fine. I think the real question is he going to be someone like Bolton, who is sort of going out of his way, who is so pathologically motivated toward, an escalatory situation that he will marshal the force of his personality to go against what I think the stream is in terms of, the kind of the sense of where the Trump is going in terms of bringing peace and resolution to these places. And my sense is not that. And I think that Trump, at this point, having not started any new wars in his first term, with people who are far, the kind of the greatest hits in terms of the warmongers, even with them, he didn't start a new war. I think for that reason, he deserves the benefit of the doubt for people whose resumes might not be perfect and might even be objectionable in some regards from the standpoint of somebody concerned um, with escalating conflict overseas.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go to some of the big names here, and I'm going to guess that Max, these are probably not have been your first choices, Max. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
Well, quickly on Bolton, and then I'll
Sure.
get to Rubio. Yeah, I agree with Darren. Waltz is not likely to be as subversive as Bolton was, who was not just motivated by his obsession with escalation and coups, but was also a complete narcissist who just wanted to cash in as a never Trumper. But Bolton did play. Trump always talks about this at his rallies, how Bolton was there frightening his opponents or those he was doing diplomacy with across the table on negotiations, because they said, who is this nut job? Whether it was Putin or Kim Jong-un. And Trump initially entered the North Korea situation, the North Korea negotiation, with the Kissinger madman strategy, threatening fire and fury on North Korea if they
By the way, Bolton advised against that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Against the meeting as such.
Yeah, of course. He advised against the meeting, then Bolton's in the meeting, and Trump, then the stage is set for something that I think was one of the most admirable things Donald Trump or any American president in my lifetime has done, which is to try to bring peace to the Korean peninsula, something 80% of South Koreans favored. And it was something so out of the box, like only someone like Donald Trump via Dennis Rodman could have done something like that, just going all the way out of the rotten foreign policy bureaucratic infrastructure to get to across the DMZ with Kim Jong-un to possibly make peace and end this war that during the war killed 20% of the North Korean population. I actually have the commemorative coin right here because it inspires me so much to see these two leaders who are so ideologically different on the same coin printed by the Trump White House. To me, it's what making peace and diplomacy is all about. And that's where John Bolton came in and destroyed it. And he did it by staging various military drills, naval drills. That's something that the national security chief and the Pentagon chief can do. And the national security advisor can control the flow of paperwork so the president can't see certain things. Cheney, as VP under Bush, did that during the Iraq War. So when confronted with something suddenly out of the box that Donald Trump does, a figure like Mike Waltz can fall under pressure from the establishment for the imperial foreign policy forces he represents and stifle or undermine diplomacy, even if he doesn't come in with the same subversive agenda as Donald Trump. Now, Marco Rubio is someone who I also don't think is likely to be as subversive to Donald Trump as those who are responsible for his career, the Bill Kristols and Bob Kagans, who helped develop Marco Rubio out of the neoconservative hothouse in Washington and South Florida. Marco Rubio is being put in appointed Secretary of State also, I think, because Donald Trump wants a Senate seat for Laura Trump. He wants a dynasty. He wants to set the stage for the future. So it's kind of a, understandable political move.
Well, and if I could add one thing,
yeah,
the whole reason Marco Rubio is free for that position is that Donald Trump did not choose him for vice president.
Wow.
Right?
Sure. I would have been shocked if he had done so. And, I wonder how that would have affected Trump among his own base, given that Marco Rubio is the Republican co-author of TPS, Temporary Protective Status, for Venezuelan and Haitian migrants who Donald Trump railed against, basically campaigned against, along with J.D. Vance, to great effect at a time when the Americans across the board are opposed to immigration. So Marco Rubio, his whole career has focused on two areas of interest. Number one, toppling the governments of countries that are deemed official enemies, especially the Cuban government, which is revenge for what he claimed his own family suffered, which was false because his family left under the US-backed Batista dictatorship, but also Venezuela and also Nicaragua. He's obsessed with that, and he's going to escalate with this Monroeist foreign policy that John Bolton also articulated, with coups, color revolutions, all kinds of sabotage and sanctions, and it will create more migrant pressure at the US-Mexico border. There's no doubt about that. And at the same time, he's focused on allowing the migrants that he and the foreign policy, the imperial foreign policy he represents, on allowing them into the US to provide a steady supply of cheap labor for US corporations that also support him. And he's obviously on board with the Israel first, Iran war agenda. He's a China hardliner. I think he would like to go further around the Taiwan Strait than Donald Trump himself would. And many of the weapons companies that are also fueling the Taiwan lobby in Washington have supported Marco Rubio. He was the chair of the China Executive Commission in the Senate. So here you have someone who's a pure product of the neoconservative movement, almost certain to take control in Foggy Bottom because liberal Democrats support him as well. So I guess maybe Darren can explain why this choice was made and why it makes sense, because it doesn't make sense to me from what I understand the America First position to be.
Well, I mean, again, I was saying he was a top figure in running to be vice president. And so, the whole reason this conversation is taking place about Secretary of State is that he chose to have J.D. Vance rather than Rubio as his vice president. And I suspect you're probably more aligned with the foreign policy positions of J.D. Vance than Rubio. I'd also say that in the case of Rubio is, where we shouldn't kind of have this ossified picture of things from 2015 and 2016. I think it definitely was the case that in 2015 and 2016, Rubio was what you would call sort of the neoconservative candidate. In fact, I think his motto even was basically borrowed a new American century. It was literally his motto, something like that, hearkening to the project for the new American century. And in fact, even more so than Jeb, you could say that he was sort of the person that a lot of these neoconservatives would have supported. Um, I think though that you have people who are again pathologically committed and ideological, whereas I don't think that Rubio is of that sort. And so again, sometimes the personality profile has to trump the previous biography. And I think the personality profile is such is that he will not be, maybe his inclinations are in a direction that are, not the same as somebody like Tulsi or somebody like JD Vance, but he is not the sort, I think, like a Pompeo or like a Bolton who would um, be a driving force in opposition to sort of the stated Trump preferences of bringing peace and resolution to the variety of global conflicts. And so I would say that Rubio even less Rubio maybe even less so than Waltz in that regard. So again, I would repeat my claim that if Trump could avoid war with Pompeo, he can certainly avoid war with Rubio, and certainly the new Rubio, who is, I think, changed quite a bit with respect to the Rubio of 2015 and 2016, which I think was, or even going back further, Rubio was in the Gang of Eight and these kinds of things. I think that he is, I think the term is evolved. I think he is politically evolved since then and understands that his success is very much tied in with embracing the Trump agenda.
All right. So Darren, if Rubio's kind of getting on the bus, the Trump bus here, what does he bring to the table in your mind to be a good Secretary of State?
Well, I mean, what does anyone bring really? I mean, what does Pompeo bring? What does any previous Secretary of State bring? In a way, it's a political calculation. He's an important figure politically. He was not given the vice president role, and so state is something that you know Trump thinks makes sense as I don't want to say a consolation, but something else. And he has foreign policy sensibilities, but I think he'll just kind of take direction from the general Trump vision. I think he will take direction on those key items of we want to bring resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. We want to avoid World War III with Iran. And as long as these people can take direction and they're loyal to Trump, which I think Rubio is and can be, what we don't want is the kinds of things that you had with Bolton. And even though Trump resisted them, they're things that you don't want to see, which is kind of secretly and nefariously engineering almost these conditions of escalation. So, engineering conditions of escalation to try to maximize the possibility that maybe Trump will fall for it, even though he didn't. And I don't think that you're going to see that type of behavior and approach from Rubio or from Waltz or from these others.
We've got a couple more big names, and then we'll probably, guys, move into sort of lightning round on some of these other names that probably, I'm guessing, won't engineer as much disagreement between the two of you, though I could be wrong. This next one probably will engineer a lot of disagreement between the two of you, I predict. We'll start with you, Max. Attorney General Matt Gaetz.
Well, I don't know how much disagreement it's going to cause between us because of the way I'm approaching this discussion, which was sort of framed as a debate. But this is like one of those old school debates hosted by William F. Buckley, where like everyone wasn't screaming at each other. But I mean, I'm coming at this from a very different perspective than Darren, and so I expect a Republican attorney general to be more like John Ashcroft and to advance a more Christian nationalist perspective on religious freedom in the First Amendment than a Democrat like Merrick Garland would, to be more pro-corporate to get caught up in a different version of racial grievance politics. And I expect Matt Gaetz to do all that. But if I think there's several important points made by Lee Fang, who is closer to my point of view than Darren probably is, in an article at Unheard, which is the progressive or left case for Matt Gaetz, recounting Matt Gaetz's history of working closely with FTC Chair Lina Khan, who many pro-corporate Democrats dislike, to crack down on what some of the people in Freedom Caucus call crony capitalism, to crack down on corporate corruption. Matt Gaetz has supported breaking up monopolies. He even went against Democrats like Zoe Lofgren in California, who's kind of a tool of Silicon Valley, to support antitrust actions against Amazon. So I think there are areas where Matt Gaetz would be better than a traditional Republican attorney general if he makes it in. And you can see from who his enemies are that these same figures wouldn't have opposed as strongly John Ashcroft, or certainly not a Jeff Sessions, who was a creature of the Senate like Marco Rubio. So, Russiagate also, there needs to be accountability for Russiagate. That was a gigantic intelligence hoax which paved the path to war with Russia and through the Ukraine proxy war. Matt Gaetz could bring accountability. There are so many areas that I think Matt Gaetz could actually bring reform. So I'm willing to wait and see, given that this is a conservative Republican administration and I exist in the real world that we live in, whether I like it or not.
Okay, so it sounds like you'd put Gaetz on the same list you'd put Gabbard on, which is, hey, I'm open-minded. Let's see what happens.
Right, and that's an extremely intelligent, I think, informed response. And I would only say, like, I wouldn't have anticipated Gaetz to be a point of contention because I think, as Max understands, he has been, again, not just graded on the curve of Republican, graded on the curve of any elected official. He's been one of the more anti-war people there, and he's even gone against President Trump at times in terms of positions on the War Powers Act and such in order to defend an anti-war position. Full disclosure, I worked for him, and I very much was in support of those positions. But yes, he is not a conventional, like Trump. He is not a conventional Republican by any means, and there is a lot, I think, for reasonable people on every area of the spectrum, except for the area of James Clapper and Brennan and the real scumbags. Except for the scumbags who hate him, there's a lot of place for reasonable people, even on the left, to support a lot of what he's done. So I think he is a firebrand in many respects. He's an extreme loyalist to Trump, to the Trump agenda, but I think the perception maybe of him as somebody who just willy-nilly is disruptor is actually false. He's very intelligent, very open-minded, has been able to make very interesting alliances when it was called for, and is just very creative and open-minded politically in a way that I think distinguishes himself not just from the regime sort of national security establishment, but from a lot of Republicans as well.
Okay. All right. So we've got a little bit more agreement on that one than I had anticipated, which is great. That's the whole purpose of these discussions. All right. Another big one, border czar, Tom Homan. Big appointment. Obviously, it's one that, can be a very polarizing topic for folks. But in terms that there needs to be a border czar to enforce the law, what do you think of him as a choice, Max?
Well, it's one of the most political positions because Trump ran on this extremely potent issue. But I'm going to kind of go out there and say, I don't think Tom Homan will be terribly different from the Biden administration in its final year after it pivoted away from TPS and put forward one of the most draconian immigration bills before Congress of any Democratic administration once they realized that Americans had turned on this issue. And we have to go back and look at public opinion to understand what brought us to this point. Not just policy, but public opinion and perception, and how the media engineered this. Under Donald Trump early on, there were already mass deportations taking place. Obama had put that in place. The National Council of La Raza denounced Obama as the deportation king or something. This is a key Democratic constituency. And the media started showing images of children in cages because many children were coming here. And this is due to US foreign policy again, of creating a narco state after enacting a coup in Honduras and sanctions along with the war on drugs across Latin America. Blowback for US foreign policy. These caravans were coming from Honduras, and many people were sending their children on their own. So they were held in cages. The media showed the cages nonstop. AOC went in a white suit and cried at the border around one of these facilities that children were held in. And the opinion of liberal Democrats shifted in support of welcoming in unaccompanied minors, and it led to the TPS policy, which in turn, at the end of the Biden administration, led to this blowback where conservative media was easily able to show some Venezuelan guys with guns running up in an apartment complex in Aurora, Colorado, and turning the public against this policy, including a majority of Democratic voters that they had previously supported. I think this contributed to Donald Trump's win and Tom Homan as borders are, but I don't think he's going to do anything particularly different. I'm interested to hear what Darren would say. There's going to.
I'm curious to hear you say that, only because I'm not in the political scene the way that you guys are, but I have heard some comments he's made that seem much more forceful than any comments
they
I've
always
heard made.
the Trump, he talks about bad hombres, and the Republicans always use the incendiary rhetoric. The Democrats can't use that kind of rhetoric because it will turn off some of the interest groups and the constituents that support them. But we've seen them willing to set records on deportations with Obama. And it wasn't just deportations, it was lateral deportations where people were flown on US taxpayer jets to cities that they weren't even from, where people were put on trial in chains en masse on the border. I've seen them pay US taxpayer money again to just put hundreds and hundreds of migrants on trial, then send tons of corporate welfare to bus them to a private prison in Eloy, Arizona, which is one of the top job creating cities. I mean, that was a Democratic program. This is bipartisan. So I think that will continue and escalate. And then we have the two other questions that need to be put out there. How will Donald Trump do this? How will he first get rid of the 1.3 million, he says, who have crimes on their record? He says it will be a military style response. How will he do that? Number two, mortgage rates are actually not dropping, even though the Fed is dropping rates. And one reason is they're based on 10-year yield treasury bonds. So investors are contributing to the refusal to drop these rates because they're afraid of mass deportations, which will hurt the construction industry and make construction more expensive. So how will Trump do that and actually hurt a big source of cheap labor for the construction industry and make housing more affordable for middle-class Americans? These are all questions that need to be put out there.
All right, Darren, response?
Well, this, I think, is a key issue. The border crisis is a key issue. This is, in many ways, the central and paradigmatic and defining issue of the Trump presidency. I think it's been elevated to almost a kind of sacral significance by the fact that it was indeed an immigration chart that Trump turned to, which saved his life by a few millimeters. That's why the bullet missed him, which is kind of interesting and poetic, if not prophetic. But I believe what Trump says. That is, if you don't have borders, you don't have a country. It is, you hear these words, about 11 million undocumented. That's the biggest lie I've ever heard. In fact, I remember in 2015, I was talking to a former Bush official who was, working in immigration with the Bush in the Bush years, and he said they did an internal tabulation, and back then under Bush, there was at least 20 million. That was under Bush. There was 20 million, and yet the number has remained 11 million for decades now. It's absurd. The number is at least 30 million at this point. Probably more. The number is 30 million. We have 30 million illegals in the interior. Millions have come in through Biden. Mayorkas, I think any kind of traditional conception of treason would apply to what Mayorkas has done with respect to the border. It's not a serious thing when anyone can simply come in. Now, I appreciate the argument that Max makes that, there's a lot of our, foreign policy decisions create instability in regions in Latin America, and that creates a lot of refugees and people want to migrate. Most of these migrants are what they call economic migrants. But even so, just because their people want to come in does not mean that you have to physically let them in. The United States is more than capable of preventing people from getting into the country if they actually want to do so, irrespective of how many people are wanting to come in, irrespective of how destabilized things are in Venezuela and other areas. To simply create a porous border situation such that millions are coming in, that's a choice. And that's a choice that we made for a very long time, and it's a choice that needs to be corrected if we want any chance of stability or even survival into the future. And I think it's very interesting when you look at the voting numbers, is that this resonates really across the board. And in fact, one interesting thing, not just that Trump won the popular vote, Trump won the vote with Latino men, despite, rhetorically being extremely hardcore in the immigration situation. Everyone with any sensibility understands that this needs to be taken under control. And as for like the cheap labor and the mortgage rates, well, for one, I thought we were against the quote unquote exploitation of cheap labor. That was one of the marks against Rubio, that he wanted people to come in for cheap labor. But secondarily, I would be very interested in seeing a tabulation of just what the cost it is.
Well, I'm against the whole way the economy's structured to make it that way. I'm not arguing. I'm not making a subjective or based argument. Just putting a question out there because we are where we are.
Right. But I would be very interested to see a very precise and objective tabulation of how much it costs to have tens of millions of illegal immigrants in the country, and to true costs that takes into account the crime, that takes into account the burden on the healthcare system, that takes into account all these different factors, and furthermore takes into account the fact that we now have a really absurd and I think unique system whereby people can come into the country illegally and their children are automatically citizens. And that costs a lot of money into perpetuity, into the generations. So I would be very interested to see like a full and precise and objective tabulation of how much on net it's costing American taxpayers to have this 20, 30 plus million illegal immigrants in the interior.
Well,
and
what about a rational conversation, like a reasonable discussion? Because there's plenty of data out there that on the one hand shows undocumented migrants who work, pay into Social Security, that they commit crimes at a lower rate than American-born Americans.
Well, wait, they commit crime at the rates lower than American-born blacks. That is a hell of a standard to apply to immigrants coming in. They should.
No, we're talking about. I don't know. I don't know where you got that from, but we're talking about all Americans across the board. Now,
Well, yes, but
the
that's
issue,
very
let me just make my
skewed.
point and I'll let you respond. Let me just
Okay.
make the quick point. The issue in Springfield, Ohio, was you had 20,000 hardworking Haitians show up, many of whom were wanted by small businesses and so on, who then are not the local school system and local healthcare system is just not able to accommodate them. And you did have an incident with a guy who had some shady driver's license, who hit a school bus, and Trump and Vance demagogued the situation and wouldn't stop talking about Haitians eating cats and dogs. And they were trying to dramatize the situation because, that's how you market something like that. But we can't have a reasonable discussion
But
about
how is that
immigration.
demagoguing the situation where Haiti is the least successful country in the entire hemisphere?
And
And
how
how much how
much
much
debt
how much
has
does the
gone to
regime have
France
to
and
hate the
colonial
people of
masters?
Springfield to dump an overwhelming amount of Haitians into their community? That's a level of contempt for your own citizens that I think surpasses even the contempt that, some historic dictator like Mao or these other peoples, even Mao Zedong wouldn't entertain the idea of dumping, Haitians and other,
Well,
populations like this
Mao
into.
Zedong wouldn't have enacted coups against foreign countries as the U.S. did to Haiti again and again in recent decades. Mao Zedong wouldn't have destroyed Haiti's economy by forcing free trade corporate deals down their throats, creating this situation, leading to mass deforestation and starvation as their rice economy was sent to Louisiana and Arkansas. But why I say they demagogued the situation was they didn't even say what you just said. They were focused on the eating and barbecuing of cats and dogs. And what needs to happen, I don't even think we disagree. There needs to be a rational debate on immigration because it's going to happen.
Right, right. And gentlemen, let me intervene because obviously we could, if we wanted to make this about immigration, we could go for several more hours
Yeah,
here.
that would have been more of a debate, I suspect.
Yeah. Well, let me do two things. One, this is a little self promotional, but for viewers who are looking for as impartial as possible of a deep dive into the immigration system, both how the legal immigration system works and what is happening just statistics wise, numbers wise with illegal immigration. I did a 2-hour interview with the head of research from the Center for Immigration Studies. I think it's probably one of the better, again, sort of nonpartisan, unbiased discussions you can find, and just trying to get the facts. If that's something you're interested in watching, just go to thoughtfulmoney.com/immigration. But Darren, if I can get you back on track to answer the question
And as long as
about specifically
we're
Homan.
prognosticating about the Trump first term, because Max is saying how Obama, deported a bunch of people. I
Well,
guarantee
basically,
Trump will
his
deport
point,
a
which
lot
I
more
want you to
people
address
than
is,
Obama.
but the point of his, which I want you to address is, he said, "Hey, I don't think Homan's going to be any more successful than the Democrats at their most strict here."
Well,
Agree or
we'll see.
disagree?
I disagree. I think that central to the understanding of what the mandate is fixing the immigration system, and that entails deportations. Deportations of a degree that will surpass what happened under Obama, and deportations of, first of all, of criminals, not criminals simply by virtue of coming in illegally, but people who've committed violent crime in our country. If you're illegal in the country and you commit violent crime, I think we should all agree that you should be booted out immediately. That, I think, is just that's a no-brainer, and there's an absolute commitment to achieving that.
Okay. All right. Well, look, let's move on. I've got two more kind of big positions, and then we'll get to our rapid fire and wrap up. All right. I'll save the fun one for last, although this one's kind of fun too. Matt, your reaction to Robert Kennedy Jr. for Health and Human Services. I'm going to guess you're maybe this might be one of yours. Hey, I'm guardedly optimistic. Let's keep an open mind, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I explained why I thought RFK was the right pick, or was the sort of inevitable pick for HHS secretary on Twitter. And it was basically that a large sector of the American public, most of which is aligned with Trump now, but many of whom might have actually been independent before the COVID event, or even liberal or left wing, want a reckoning for what was done to them
Yep.
during the COVID event, through the lockdowns and the mandates. And, I broke with most of the left over this. I was kind of baffled that so many leftists who say they support workers' rights and so on supported this agenda, which just empowered tech billionaires and the remote work economy, and punished children, especially poor children, especially children of color, by forcing them to stay in their homes for months and months at a time, homes that often didn't have Wi-Fi. RFK spoke to that. He had an apparatus set up through Children's Health Defense to speak to it, to reach people. I remember watching him early on in the pandemic and hearing him discuss how when a vaccine is produced, there is simply no way it will be able to vaccinate against an aerosolized virus and prevent infection or transmission, which basically invalidates the whole logic behind the mandates, which is that if everybody just gets vaccinated, then we'll wipe out this virus. And
Right.
so RFK was right about all that. And what started happening was people started to question more about the science, and they started to question the scientific and technocratic elite. I don't know if you're going to bring up Jay Bhattacharya, but he's someone I interviewed on my Rockfin channel during the COVID event as one of the founders of the Great Barrington Declaration, which brought together scientists and medical professionals to oppose the devastating lockdowns, the medically devastating lockdowns that were so harmful to people's psychological health, that caused mass opioid death, that doomed so many small businesses, turned our city centers into zombie zones. Jay Bhattacharya was another person who was right about that, and he's being discussed as a potential NIH pick. So I think for a Republican administration, this is all very refreshing. RFK can take on the agribusiness industry if he's willing to, if he's able to, if he can get past the McDonald's hazing rituals with Trump and actually take on big food, which is responsible for one of the worst public health crises in this country, which is obesity. If he can do that in a Republican administration, it would be amazing, because Democratic HHS secretaries have been unwilling to oppose these lobbies as well. And so there is an opportunity here. What just out criticism of RFK that I think relates to energy policy, because I don't know if we're going to talk about the energy pick, but I think that either a Democratic or Republican administration needs to recognize, but particularly, the Democrats who've pushed the Green New Deal. And I think even AOC recognizes this. You can't set the country on a path away from carbon emissions and extractive industries with just solar and hydroelectric and windmills and so on. Even if you believe in that stuff, you have to put nuclear in the mix. And RFK has opposed nuclear as an environmental lawyer. And I think one of the best things to make America great again would be to build small publicly owned nuclear plants. RFK has opposed that, but I think he'll go along with. I don't think he has any control over energy. It was just a quick point I wanted to make.
Okay, Darren, jump in here.
Yeah, in fact, Trump has said publicly multiple times that he said, "I love you, RFK. You're great. You're going to have, free reign when it comes to health, but leave the energy to me," because RFK's position on energy is certainly not entirely aligned with some of the key elements that Trump likes, and is probably not aligned with the pick for the Department of Energy. But yeah, as for RFK generally, I think he's critical. I think a reckoning for what happened during COVID is absolutely essential. What I'm hoping for this entire second term is to set America on a footing to restore legitimacy, to the institutions like the Department of Justice and these other. And part of restoring legitimacy is to have a full hearing and airing out of the very real and very bad crimes that have taken place under the auspices of these institutions. And I can't think of a greater crime other than maybe like genocide or something like that. I can't think of a greater crime in recent history than the crime of COVID policy, of locking down people, of locking down the economy. And it's not just a crime against the economy, which is something very significant in its own right. One of the major studies that we conducted at Revolver News several years ago was to apply something called the life years metric, because there's an established economic literature showing how the decline in earnings translates to a decline of health and life expectancy. And we apply sort of translating the economic impact into the health impact of the COVID lockdowns, and found that there's no justification for the lockdowns, even in terms of health, because a lot of the discussion surrounding it was, oh, it's, the economy versus people's lives. You can't fully disaggregate the two, because again, there's an established literature on, if you have decreased earning potential, that translates into economic effects. For instance, you don't have a job, you get addicted to drugs, you die earlier, you get in alcohol. There are all sorts of reasons for that. The COVID lockdowns, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it was a crime against humanity. It is something unlike a lot of the things that we've been talking about, like foreign policy and these kinds of things. They're extremely important, but in many ways they're distant from the average citizen. Whereas I think the COVID thing was a rare case of something that so profoundly impacted the life and the quality of life of people. And for nothing really. And it's just such a shame to imagine that, just like there's been no real accountability for the criminals behind the Iraq war, there's been no accountability for the criminals behind the collapse and financial collapse in 2008. To think that the criminals behind COVID will get away with it and there'll be no sort of reckoning is a very frustrating thing to entertain. And I think that the closest that we'll get to that would be somebody like Kennedy at the helm in the position that he's in, and to correct things going forward. So for that reason, even though there are a lot of things that I disagree with him very strongly, I mean, he's come out, he's in favor of like reparations, and he's in favor of some crazy stuff. That's irrelevant.
He's in favor of genocide in Gaza, also crazy.
Well, there you go. I mean, maybe we disagree on that, but all of that stuff we can agree that's irrelevant. What's relevant is he is the avatar for the reckoning that the American people deserve in relation to the crimes that were perpetrated against them in the COVID era. Crimes that should never happen again, and crimes that need to be addressed in order to restore legitimacy to our institutions. That's the thing. People characterize some of these things as, there's, Trump is disruptive, or putting someone like Matt Gaetz of the DOJ is disruptive. And yes, there's a temporary disruption, but it's a necessary disruption. And it's what's necessary toward putting us on an ultimate course towards stability. You need the disruption in order to have legitimacy and the faith in the institutions that is ultimately central to having a functioning and successful nation for the remainder of the century. So I'm hoping that will be achieved in this second term. I think there's every reason to be optimistic for that. Again, critically optimistic, cautiously optimistic, but I think Trump has earned that optimism and that benefit of the doubt through the incredible feats that he's achieved, and a lot of these appointments that are so great and that frankly would be inconceivable in any other context, in any other party. And so again, I think he's earned that optimism. And if things go right in this second term, the stakes aren't just a politically successful second term. The stakes are setting America back on the footing to be a successful country and to be a free country going into the remainder of the century.
Yeah, can I
Okay.
piggyback off that really quickly?
Sure. Very
You know,
quickly, because we have to get to a
as
sponsor
an
message.
institution, the NIH's credibility has been harmed very, very badly by Fauci, by Francis Collins, Jay Bhattacharya, through an investigation of COVID origins, gain of function, but also especially the biowarfare programs that have operated possibly covertly out of the NIH need to take place. RFK is being accused by his opponents of seeking to ban vaccines. That seems to be very far from the truth. But there's a real issue out there where a lot of Americans who suffered under COVID, who watched the mRNA vaccines fail on all their stated promises, started to question all of the vaccines that are mandated for children so that they can go to school. And one of the things the manufacturers have refused to do is provide real safety data on those vaccines and to actually test them against real placebos. RFK could get them to produce the safety profile in a credible way and convince people, which has never happened. And also, people who suffered vaccine related injuries should be able to get reparations. I think those are reparations Darren would support.
Sure.
But the 1985 bill passed under the Reagan administration indemnifies all the vaccine makers against lawsuits from people who have been harmed by their products. So this was supposedly needed so they could conduct more research and produce more. But this is the problem standing in the way of the credibility of the pharmaceutical industry that they refuse to address. So RFK could actually force them to reassure the part of the American public that's lost faith in them. This is something I think very few of his opponents are willing to acknowledge. They just want to use brute force to crush him and impose their agenda rather than actually engage the American public where they are.
All right, thanks, gentlemen. Important job. It looks like both of you are optimistic. Kennedy is a good guy, if not the right guy for it. So we'll move on from here. I do want to get to the new Department of Government Efficiency, which will be co-headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Very quickly, before we get there, we have another message from today's sponsor.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power of gold and silver to grow your wealth, whether you're an experienced investor or new to the game. These precious metals have a long history of being a safe haven for your savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice. So where does the average investor go to buy gold and silver? That's easy. JM Bullion. JM Bullion is one of the most popular and most trusted precious metals retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium products that can be delivered to your door in safe, discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of gold to an entire mint box of silver, JM Bullion offers precious metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget, now is the time to start investing in precious metals and start protecting yourself and your savings against these volatile markets. Visit jmbullion.com today to take a look at our wide variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.
All right, and we're back. All right, so we're going to now pivot to the Department of Government Efficiency. Very quickly, Darren, just a sentence. We don't have time to get into it in depth, but sounds like Max was feeling pretty good that, I think it was Max, who felt pretty good about Bhattacharya as the nominee for the National Institute of Health. Do you feel similarly?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. All right, so to the real chainsaw that Trump is bringing to the table here, to the size and the scope of government, and really trying to drastically potentially reduce it, as well as to make it more efficient. He's appointed, like I said, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Musk actually asked Trump if he would consider making this department, volunteered to run it. Vivek, when he was running during the primaries, it was all about just sort of, decimating the size of government. A, what do you guys think about the mission of this new department? And B, what do you think about the people who've been tapped to run it? Max, we'll start with you.
Well, I'll take this Doge seriously as seriously as I took Dogecoin in the first hour at Robinhood. I'll take it seriously if they actually address what just took place today, which is that the Pentagon has failed its 7th audit in a row, and $1 trillion is missing. Okay, everything else pales in comparison to that. And so if you're not going to go in there and force an audit of the Pentagon and then cut all of the waste and all of the money going to the Beltway bandits that are just corporate welfare for the upper class in Northern Virginia, then all of these corrupt programs that do nothing, it's all there. If Pete Hegseth is actually willing to take that on, then I will cheer. Everybody supports that except for Congress. Bernie Sanders issued a bill calling for a fine on the Pentagon, a massive fine if it failed an audit. It failed. And Democrats and Republicans came together to make sure that that bill had no teeth and didn't pass. So there's one thing. The National Endowment for Democracy, Congress authorizes $200 to $300 million for this regime change arm of the US government every year. At the Gray Zone, we've exposed through leaked internal documents of the NED how it's been taken over by people that Darren would call woke progressives, who are obsessed with using they're advancing color revolutions to push their agenda on the world. We recently did a piece on the NED pushing regime change in Bangladesh. And one of the activities they were using to advance regime change was drag shows attended by staffers of the US Embassy. So I feel like with this kind of administration and this kind of personnel, we want them to see this material and to start cutting these neoconservative programs, which advance nothing but instability around the world. Otherwise, I'm just going to see it as a major attack, an attempt to kind of run a buzzsaw through social services and civil servants who work on programs that provide like public education, housing, and things like that, while Trump enacts what looks like a giant tax cut for the rich. And since Elon Musk was brought up before, I just want to address one area where he has been influential or involved on foreign policy. And I support Elon Musk if he's actually meeting with Iran's foreign minister and trying to turn down the temperature there, then that's a very welcome initiative, and he deserves credit for that. But he suddenly became interested in Venezuela when a US-backed candidate whose entire campaign was paid for by US interests, Maria Corina Machado, was seeking an election victory in Venezuela. Elon Musk was cheering it on. This is someone who's very interested in lithium because he needs it for his electric batteries. Everyone who's involved in the EV revolution needs it. He said in 2019 that he will coup whoever he wants, referring to the Bolivian government that had just been overthrown, the popular Bolivian government, after someone asked him about his lithium interests in Bolivia. And I think the question needs to be asked, did Maria Corina Machado promise Elon Musk or other Trump loyalists like Eric Prince any area of Venezuelan public assets, like its mineral wealth, if she were to come into power? That to me shows a level of staggering corruption. And I just want to know why he was so interested in Venezuela, this country that Darren was right. There are economic migrants coming here from Venezuela whose economy has been destroyed through this US program of sanctioning their country. And you can't address this problem unless you stop attacking Venezuela's economy. The Washington Post was even a big supporter of regime change in Venezuela, ran a major feature with data showing how US sanctions on Venezuela since 2015 have directly correlated with rises in migrant pressure and migrant entries to the US from Venezuela through the US-Mexico border. So where is Elon Musk on that? And I'll kick it to Darren to, I think, praise Doge.
True, Darren, or what are your honest thoughts there on this?
Well, Going back before Doge, I was one of the people who was very publicly, very strongly calling for Elon to acquire what is now known as X. I think in the vast bureaucracies and these, very strong inertial forces that, shape political destiny, there are very few occasions for an individual really to make a big difference, to be what some people call a quote unquote live player, and to step into the arena and really make a difference. And furthermore, what I've seen, and there are a handful of laudable exceptions, but you have this, I don't know if I can use this kind of language, but you have this concept, fuck you money, right? You make enough money so you can really do whatever you want. And yet, empirically, based on my experience, that's such a rare thing that people who have that kind of money actually behave accordingly, because there are a lot of risks. There are a lot of entanglements. Somebody like Elon Musk, if he had had a political transformation earlier, should be very thankful that he only learned some things after the fact, because he never would have been allowed to build SpaceX to where it is and have the government effectively outsource NASA to SpaceX. I don't know if you've been following this. NASA has become a complete joke. NASA wasn't, and these other companies like Boeing that have become a complete joke. They had astronauts stranded in the space station for months and needed SpaceX to bail them out. So Elon has that. He has Starlink. He has a lot of things that are very important to the government and its interests, which in a way you could say, oh, that means he's controlled by the government. Well, it's an entanglement, but it also means he has leverage. It also means that he can't simply be destroyed. And so for someone of that stature to step in and acquire X, Twitter was just a hotbed of influence operations, all kinds of things of, intelligence agencies trying to influence things one way or another. Things like the Integrity Initiative, which I'm sure, Max knows a tremendous amount about. All of these things were just proliferating throughout X. And it's belies the actual value of X. Elon bought it for something like 40 billion. I made the arguments like, look, that sounds like a huge price tag to us, but that's less than the market cap of a company like Home Depot. R.I.P. Bernie Marcus. That's less than the market cap of Home Depot. And yet, the question of who controls something like X is vastly more consequential than the question of who's the CEO of Home Depot, right? And that's why all of these intelligence agencies were just desperate, just chomping at the bit to get in there. And so, for Elon to step in and to change the nature of X, so now it's like the most popular news source in the country, if not the world, exceeded Fox in many ways. For him to step in and restore a free speech regime and work seriously toward unearthing the nefarious activities that were occurring that was a first major step. And I think at that point, he was perceptive enough to see that you can't go half in. Once you do something that disruptive, there's a target on your back. And so the costs are already built in. So you might as well go all the way, because that's your only chance at survival. So whether he liked it or not, his fate was intertwined in a way with Trump at that point. And he stepped in still further into the arena and became one of Trump's most effective advocates. So I think this is like a phenomenal case, really an amazing case of someone with everything to lose actually putting it on the line. And whenever somebody does that, it's a really hard thing to do, and the evidence for that is that so few people actually do it. Because when people get to a certain level of wealth, there's a risk aversion that comes in that's really profound, more profound than I think people realize. And so for Elon Musk to look beyond that and look in longer terms, look in civilizational terms, to think in terms of what's going to create the conditions to be a genuinely spacefaring civilization. To think in those terms, I think, is very laudable. And I think he's taken the necessary steps in that direction. So I have to just applaud him for that. As far as the Doge, I think we have every reason to be optimistic for that. And I think he will not, I think he has actually tweeted publicly and addressed publicly the Pentagon audit situation. So that's not something that he's unaware of. He's very much aware of it. And I have every expectation that he will address it through the functions of Doge. And it's not just the Pentagon, but also the social services. There's so much waste, and there's a distinction between the waste of these sort of constellation of NGOs that actually are extremely counterproductive and malicious and even poisonous. And then there's stuff that's just dumb and a waste of money. And I think they'll start at the stuff that's poisonous, and then the dumb waste of money stuff. There's probably at least $500 billion, if not $1 trillion there. So if you look at Elon's history, this is not just anybody. And Vivek is exceptionally talented in his own right. But when you look at Elon Musk, of what he's created and his demonstrated capacity for follow through, I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic that if anyone can undertake the seemingly impossible task of cutting the fat and the poison out of the government, it would be Elon Musk. So, and the fact that he was actively requesting this task, I think, is also encouraging. It wasn't just a consolation, say, here, take this. It was something that he actively desired to do. And it's something that I think is very capable of doing, because you don't run successfully and create multiple world-changing companies if you don't know how to efficiently allocate capital and cut the fat. So let's wait and see, but there's no reason not to be optimistic about that.
Okay. So, gentlemen, there's a number of appointments we're just not going to be able to get to, though I'm glad we started with the real big ones that I think most folks are interested in, just because we're coming up on the 2-hour mark here. So I do want to start wrapping up. Folks, I am sadly not going to be able to bring in individual audience questions for the time constraints, but I'm going to wrap them into this sort of last main question, and then we'll close things up. And Dan, why don't I start with you? I've been asking this of experts on my channel over the past week, and I think you two are very some of the best people to ask this question to. Let's assume for a minute. Let's give Trump the benefit of the doubt that he's going to be successful with these programs that he's already announced, right? That this disruption that he wants to enact, he wants to use tariffs, or at least the threat of them, to negotiate better deals for America with other countries. He is going to deport millions of people that he doesn't think should be here right now. That Elon and Vivek are going to radically shrink the size of government and make it more efficient. The question is can Trump be successful with those goals in the long term without near-term pain in the economy? Right? It seems like you got to break some eggs to make an omelet. It seems like we're going to be breaking a lot of eggs here. Those things are going to be disruptive. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that, whether you think it is going to require short-term pain, or if that somehow can be avoided. But if you think it's going to require short-term pain, should that be a priority now of the Trump administration to start selling that message? Hey, we got a lot of problems. I got a bold future. We're going to end up at a great place, but we're all going to have to we're all going to have to shoulder some collective responsibility on doing the hard work to get to where we want to go. Because right now it seems that people are kind of riding a high from the election. They've been promised a lot of great change. They haven't really been told what the cost of that's going to be. So Darren, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, but would love to get your thoughts on this, and then Max will let you chime in.
That's a great question. And, the idea of short-term pain is so antithetical to, I think, the contemporary character of things, but sometimes it's necessary and what you need in order to set things afoot. I suspect and hope that a lot of the changes in the economy, in energy, some of the deregulation, um, and those types of things would help to provide a cushion that would actually avoid a temporary pain in any regard. But I would also say that if temporary pain is required, it should absolutely be welcome, embraced, and accepted. Because again, this is not about just having a successful second term, although I think that's going to happen. It's about the longer term of setting America on the foundations such that it can be successful and free into the end of the century and beyond. Elon Musk said this publicly. And I think this terms of thinking it's rare, but it's something that it should be absolutely celebrated and encouraged. It's thinking, what are the preconditions for us becoming a spacefaring civilization? Sometimes to achieve great things, you need to endure temporary pain. And I understand the reality of it is that's totally antithetical to the way that people think now when everything is about instant gratification. And I think there's a very good chance that short-term pain isn't required because of the economics of things, of a lot of Trump's economic policies. But I put on the table that even if for some reason the short-term pain is required, it's something that we should embrace and will absolutely be worth it. In some ways, I kind of hope that it's required because that tells you that you're really doing something serious.
Okay, great. Max?
Well, I'm not a proponent of Trump's entire domestic agenda, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask. Don't really want to live in a country where hedge funders and corporations take more control of public education than they've already taken. I've seen the disaster it's caused in my own city, and that seems to be on the table, but that's sort of, not what I'm here to debate or discuss, or the conventional economic wisdom right now, which is that Trump, by doing tax cuts and tariffs, could actually increase inflation and undermine all of his promises to fix grocery prices for so many people who voted for him, who suffered under the Biden administration. The issue that will destroy Trump's entire agenda is if he allows this train to continue, this World War III train to continue to careen towards direct war with Russia and Iran. And it seems like, at least in the latter case, he's allowing it to go there. We haven't even talked about his pick for U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who sees Israel, he was an ignorant, puerile Christian Zionist who sees Israel as the future landing pad for the Messiah, which Pete Hegseth sees as a place where the third temple should be constructed after the third holiest site in Islam, the Al-Aqsa compound, is destroyed by fanatical settlers who want to continuously sacrifice sheep to sanctify God. I mean, this is fanaticism. Elise Stefanik, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, is basically the U.S. Israeli reciprocal ambassador to the UN, and her job in Congress as an award winner of the Miriam Adelson Freedom Award was to crush free speech and free association on college campuses while advancing the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which even J.D. Vance, I believe, opposed because it's such an assault on free speech. Where are the conservative free speech warriors? Well, Ben Shapiro was supporting it while he took Elon Musk to Auschwitz after Elon Musk took on the ADL and realized there was actually a force more powerful than the so-called richest man in America. Even after he had taken on so many other powerful forces at Twitter, he had to bow to the power of the Israel lobby and the Zionist movement. And that should really tell us something about the danger that is faced in this Trump administration. It's a danger that could destroy the global economy. A regional war across from Iran through Lebanon and Palestine would be disastrous. And there's no guarantee that, despite the righteous arguments that J.D. Vance put forward in the New York Times for ending the Ukraine proxy war, that the bureaucratic World War III lobby inertia won't produce more escalation under a Trump administration, as it did in the first Trump administration when Trump became the first American president against his own wishes to authorize offensive weaponry to the Ukrainian military. This all often his agenda can boomerang and leave him overwhelmed by forces he claims to oppose. So it's really up to the movement behind him to keep the pressure on, to not just, worship him or be blinded by partisanship. And that's why I wanted to participate in this debate, because maybe some of them are watching and can still think critically about what's taking place.
All right. Thank you, Max. Well, gentlemen, we'll have to end it there very quickly. Darren, for people that would like to follow you in your work after watching this, where should they go?
I'm on Twitter or X at Darren J. Beattie, DarrenJBeattie. And for some of the groundbreaking investigative work we've referenced, Revolver.news. Revolver.news. We have a great piece up right now on what Matt Gaetz could do as Attorney General to reform the Department of Justice. So check that out, Revolver.news.
All right. And Max, where should folks go to follow you?
I think they know where to go, but Max Blumenthal on Twitter, thegrayzone.com, Gray Zone on all the social media channels, except we're not on Blue Sky yet. Thanks again.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for this. Thank you again as well to Zero Hedge for putting on this debate, producing it. Thank you to JM Bullion for sponsoring it. Again, I'm Adam Taggart, founder and host of ThoughtfulMoney.com. I do deep dive interviews 4 days a week on topics just like this. If you'd like to find out what we offer, just go to ThoughtfulMoney.com. Darren, Max, thank you so much. Really great discussion over the past 2 hours. Very much appreciated.
Can I just say one last thing?
Sure.
Just kind of a joke, because people tell me sometimes, depending on, how I get out of bed, that I look like Bob Dylan. I could be a Bob Dylan impersonator. I think, Max, if the Gray Zone gig doesn't work out, you could join a Coldplay tribute band. I don't know if you ever heard that.
That's
You look just like Chris Martin.
You're saying Chris Martin? Yeah.
Yeah.
I get
He's handsomer. Max is handsomer.
I get Steve from 90210 and the guy from Homeland. Some guy on Grey's Anatomy, but that's a new one.
It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
No, thank you. And everybody else, thank you so much for watching.